Hey guys, tonight we drift into the shimmering heat of a different world, Tenochtitlan, capital of the Aztec Empire. You're standing at the edge of a causeway, watching canoes slice through lake water like obsidian blades. The temples rise ahead, sharp against the dusky sky, and something tells you this city doesn't run on hugs and good intentions. You move through the bustling market, the smell of roasted maize mixing with incense and a hint of something metallic. A priest walks by, face painted half red, half black, trailing a small crowd of nervous villagers. The platform in the center of the square isn't for speeches, it's for justice. Not the gavel-banging courtroom kind, but the ceremonial, spine-tingling variety. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're watching this from somewhere unusual, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk a little faster past the tall stone carvings of gods with wide eyes and tongues shaped like blades. The Aztecs didn't believe in justice as something separate from religion. Every law had the fingerprints of a deity on it. Steal a few cacao beans? That's not just theft. It's a personal insult to Tlazolteotl, goddess of sin and purification. And she doesn't just forgive, you have to earn it, possibly while crying into a cactus. In fact, the Aztec system of punishment was heavily layered, based on class, intention, and even whether you confessed voluntarily. Ordinary theft might earn you slavery, but steal as a noble? That could be death because you're supposed to know better. And of course, death didn't always mean a quick neck snap. Sometimes it meant being slowly sacrificed atop a temple while the crowd watched with grim satisfaction, pretending this was about justice and not excellent midday entertainment. Punishment wasn't random. It was precise. It had rhythm. You'd see repeat offenders wearing the same shame-marking hairstyles or walking barefoot across city stones as a sort of public announcement. Hey, I messed up, but I'm trying. There was even something like an ancient plea bargain. You could voluntarily confess to a priest and receive a reduced penalty, though reduced might still involve fasting in a smoky chamber or enduring a symbolic stabbing with maguey spines. And speaking of spines, did you know these plant thorns were used not just for religious bloodletting, but also for punishments? Being made to self-pierce your tongue or ears wasn't just a spiritual offering. It was sometimes a mandated sentence. Imagine modern courts handing out pierce your own lip day instead of community service. Historians still argue whether these rituals always had legal motivations, or were more about dramatic, theatrical guilt cleansing. Either way, you wouldn't be smiling afterward. Now you might ask, what about jail? Did the Aztecs have prisons? The answer is, sort of. Short-term holding cells, sure. But long-term incarceration wasn't the vibe. The goal was correction or removal fast. The justice system was built for decisive, sometimes brutal clarity, not decades of appeals and quiet regret. The high point of this structured chaos? The Tlaxcatlan, Aztec courts run by noble judges. These were highly trained men who wore specific costumes while presiding over cases. Think more warrior lawyer in feathers than powdered wig and robes. They held court in the Tecpan, a palace complex, and decisions could be appealed all the way up to the emperor himself. Though let's be honest, if your appeal reached the emperor, your odds were probably already cactus thin. But here's something unexpected. Community service did exist. Minor offenses might be punished with mandatory public works, cleaning canals, maintaining roads. So, yes, the same society that flayed people alive also handed out what was essentially ancient Aztec probation. A reminder that even the most blood-splattered cultures sometimes just want their trash taken out on time. And here's a fringe tidbit for you. In some communities, women caught gossiping could be sentenced to sweeping streets barefoot while carrying a symbolic burden, like a heavy basket of stones. Justice didn't just punish actions, it corrected character. Or at least it tried to. You duck past a ceremonial platform where a young man in nothing but a loincloth kneels with his arms tied behind him. He's surrounded by flower petals and singing priests. This isn't justice as you know it, this is cosmic alignment. To punish is to balance, and in this world, balance often demands blood. Now the atmosphere in the city changes when a big sacrifice is scheduled. There's a crackle in the air like ozone before a storm. Vendors pack up early. People whisper about the crime, the offender, the symbolism. Was he disrespectful to elders? Did he damage temple property? The stories swirl like incense smoke. And here's the twist. Not all who were sacrificed were being punished. Some were honored, even volunteered, as captives meant to appease the gods. It's hard to draw the line between justice and religion in Tenochtitlan. Historians still debate whether punishment-based executions and sacrificial rites were seen as completely distinct or overlapping forms of public control. You pass by a mural that shows a familiar scene. An offender on their knees surrounded by officials, the god Tezcatlipoca looming behind them in painted glory. Tezcatlipoca, by the way, wasn't exactly the deity of forgiveness. He was more into mirrors that showed you your worst self in jaguar-shaped justice. Basically, your Aztec therapist if your therapist had claws. The air grows still. The city hums, its rhythms ancient and unrelenting. You begin to see that here punishment was not just consequence, it was performance, purification, restoration. The whole empire pulsed with the need to please the gods and keep social harmony, sometimes one severed finger at a time. And as the day fades into twilight, you realize something odd. The people here don't seem afraid of justice. They respect it. They prepare for it. They wrap it in ritual, soak it in symbolism, and yes, sometimes, just sometimes, they laugh at its weirdest quirks. You shuffle past a row of carved stone faces, their eyes wide with eternal judgment, and you feel the heat rising from the baked earth beneath your feet. Welcome to the Aztec justice system, where even being a little annoying could get you publicly humiliated with a cactus, and that's on the lighter side of the law. Punishment in the Aztec world wasn't just about pain, it was about presentation. You're not tossed into a dungeon to rot. Oh no, you're made an example. You are seen. And if you're going to be punished, it's not just your body that suffers. It's your pride, your status, and sometimes your hairstyle. Yes, your hair. Let's say you committed a minor offense, like repeatedly disobeying your elders. You might be made to sweep public walkways barefoot while wearing filthy clothes and an especially humiliating hairdo called the nemantemi. It involved shaving parts of your head while leaving awkward tufts to stand out in the crowd. Basically, Aztec justice served with a side of bad hair day. Other penalties included public shaming rituals that were almost performance art. You'd be walked through the market square while neighbors muttered things like, "Oh, he touched the sacred maize pile." Again. If you were lucky, you just get a few jabs of gossip. If not, you might get literal jabs from maguey spines. Now, for teenage offenders, things escalated quickly. Disobedient adolescents could be dragged by the ear to the Telpakali, the youth training school. There, your punishment might include carrying firewood until your arms trembled or inhaling spicy smoke. An olfactory reminder that rebellion stings. And if you were really unruly, they'd take you to the center square and press hot chili peppers under your nose. Spicy justice, Aztec style. Historians still argue whether these punishments were meant purely for discipline or if they doubled as early community theater. Because honestly, it's hard not to see the dramatic potential in a barefoot kid carrying a sack of beans up and down temple stairs while elders chant his infractions to a drumbeat. Adults weren't exempt either. Say you committed fraud, maybe you faked a measurement of beans in the market. You might be forced to pay reparations and then parade around wearing a special neck yoke shaped like a snake, symbolizing deceit. This wasn't just restitution. This was Instagram-level call-out culture, 15th century edition. A particularly telling punishment involved a tlaquilo, a scribe, recording your name and crime in codices. Yes, that's right, you could be historically archived as a cheater, liar, or temple graffiti vandal. Your misdeeds weren't just remembered, they were illustrated. Future generations flipping through sacred manuscripts would see a little drawing of you, hunched in shame, probably labeled, "This guy messed up." But nothing says, "You've disappointed us," like the infamous spine ritual. For certain moral crimes like adultery or repeated drunkenness, especially among the elite, offenders were expected to endure a symbolic bloodletting using sharp maguey thorns. The wounds were superficial, but the statement was not. You were literally bleeding out your guilt for all to see. Kind of like a tattoo, but temporary and way less fun. And here's a fringe tidbit for your dreams tonight. Some punishments included making the offender sleep outside naked. Yes, the Aztecs had their version of being grounded, and it was chilly. You'd lie on woven mats while others passed by, reminding you not to mess with ritual protocol or insult the maize god. And if it rained, Well, consider that divine reinforcement. Oh, and speaking of the gods, each one had specific rules, and violating them could lead to themed punishments. Disrespecting Zyptotec, the flayed god of agriculture and renewal, could earn you a sentence involving wearing rough bark clothes or symbolic cuts across your chest, just enough to make you understand the peeling back of your moral layers. Comforting, but let's not forget the subtle punishments, the emotional ones. An accused person could be made to confess in front of their entire Kalpuli community group. There'd be speeches, ceremonial sighing, maybe even group chanting of your sins, like a really awkward group therapy session, only with more feathers and fewer chairs. You shuffle into a courtyard where a young man kneels beside a bowl of ashes, murmuring apologies. His punishment? Public contrition for using a ceremonial vessel incorrectly. His job now is to tend a sacred fire for 4 days without sleeping. Every time he nods off, someone shakes a rattle and whispers, "Balance, brother." That's Aztec subtlety for, "Don't mess up again." Historians often debate the balance of mercy versus severity in Aztec law. Some argue the punishments were inherently violent, meant to scare people into obedience. Others point out the flexibility of confession, community restitution, and symbolic pain, elements that suggest a nuanced, if unforgiving, approach to justice. What's clear is this: Aztec punishments weren't about vengeance. They were about restoring harmony to the cosmic order. Or at least, that's what the gods told them. You pass a mural showing a man being made to walk through cactus patches barefoot as part of his atonement. The artist really captured the agony on his face, one toe mid-prick. There's a little dog watching him, tail wagging. Even the dog seemed to enjoy public penance. And yes, here's your obligatory quirky note. In some regions, part of your sentence could include drinking a disgusting herbal brew that induced, let's call it, temporary intestinal cleansing. The goal wasn't poison, it was purging physically and spiritually. It's the Aztec equivalent of detox tea, except it came with chance and probably regret. By the time night falls, the square is mostly empty. You sit on a worn stone, thinking about how justice here was as much performance as punishment. The goal wasn't just to penalize the offender. It was to realign them with society, to stitch them back into the fabric of the community, sometimes painfully, sometimes with cactus needles. And as a soft wind picks up through the city, you can't help but wonder, how different is this from modern life? Sure, your boss might not make you sweep streets barefoot, but public shaming? Reputation management? Social performance of guilt? Maybe the cactus is just digital now. You shuffle deeper into the heart of the city, following the scent of something smoky and slightly sweet, copal resin used in religious ceremonies. And here, justice isn't just carried out by warriors or judges. No, this time you're heading into the domain of the priests, where punishment takes on a distinctly spiritual flavor. Literally, sometimes, you're guided toward a low, thick-walled structure called a kalmakak, a temple school where future priests and nobles train. This is where moral failure meets incense smoke. And if you think priests just sit around chanting and offering vague life advice, think again. Aztec priests were also enforcers of divine order. They handled confessions, yes, but they weren't handing out hugs. Let's say you broke a moral law. Maybe you disrespected a ritual or insulted your ancestors, which was impressively easy to do, given how many rituals and ancestors there were. You'd go to a priest to confess. Voluntarily. Sort of. See, confession wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. If you didn't confess and someone else tattled on you, the punishment would be far worse. Confessing meant you were willing to accept your cosmic guilt, and that gave you at least a smidge of sympathy. You kneel on woven mats, incense burning nearby, and speak your sins into the air. The priest listens quietly, then offers a ritual purge. But this isn't just a polite sermon. It might involve long fasts, ceremonial weeping, or drinking a concoction made from cornmeal, crushed herbs, and you guessed it, just a dash of symbolic discomfort. Some reports suggest these purifying drinks included ground insects or bits of chili. Because what's atonement without internal exfoliation? And here's where it gets itchily weird. In certain healing punishment rituals, you might also be smeared with medicinal pastes, clay, herbs, and yes, sometimes crocodile dung. Not as punishment exactly, but as purification. A kind of spiritual mud mask. If your mud mask could potentially bite back. Fringe historians still argue whether the crocodile dung had any medicinal benefit, or if it was mostly a scare tactic to make sinners reconsider their choices. Sometimes, a sinner would be required to lay prostrate before a ceremonial fire for hours, breathing in the pungent smoke of burning sage and chili pepper resin. The fumes were meant to open the soul, or at least clog the sin out of your sinuses. It was intense but technically non-violent, unless, of course, you count spiritual combustion as violence. For repeat offenders or those who clearly needed a stronger lesson, priests might supervise a symbolic ritual called tlazali, which involved confessing your sins while being gently whipped with a bundle of stiff reeds. It wasn't supposed to draw blood, just tears, and possibly sneezes depending on how dusty those reeds were. One famous case in oral records describes a market vendor who lied about the purity of his silver. After confession, he was ordered to sit in public with a fake tongue made of obsidian hanging around his neck, a sharp reminder, quite literally, that lies have edges. Customers walked by and chuckled, but they also knew this man had been ritually corrected. His crime was catalogued, his soul cauterized. Hopefully. Still, scholars debate how widespread and standardized these punishments really were. Did every priest follow the same handbook? Probably not. Local temples had their own customs, influenced by regional deities and community norms. What passed for light penance in one town might be a full-blown sacred spectacle in another. You duck into a shadowed corridor, where murals depict the goddess Tlazolteotl, the eater of filth. Literally, that was her divine job. She consumed moral corruption. If you confessed under her watch, your sins were believed to vanish into her being. A little horrifying, a little sweet, like a cosmic Roomba for human guilt. But Tlazolteotl wasn't a passive listener. Some say she demanded that sinners truly feel the weight of their crimes. That's why confessions weren't made in secret. They were done before a witness, often with incense, chants, and lots of trembling. And if you didn't seem sufficiently shaken, the priest might add a few days of ritual silence or make you carry out symbolic penance, like walking in circles around a maze altar holding a skull. One curious account mentions a woman caught stealing ritual cloth. Her sentence? She had to spend 7 days washing ceremonial garments in cold river water, at night. The idea was to use discomfort as clarity, not torture, just an educational soak. Sometimes, however, the line between penance and punishment blurred. A drunkard might be made to vomit publicly into a ritual basin, then offer a prayer of thanks for cleansing the self. Meanwhile, children of the elite who misbehaved could be brought to the temple to be scared straight, with a viewing of human sacrifices in progress. Just a light afternoon of terror to build character. Now it's tempting to roll your modern eyes at this, but think about it. Aztec punishments weren't designed to isolate or abandon the guilty. They were meant to pull people back into harmony. You messed up? Fine. Here's your chance to fix it. It's going to involve tears, smoke, and maybe something unpleasant on your face, but afterward, you're part of the community again. That's strangely comforting. The temple courtyard opens up again. A thin trail of incense rises into the stars. Nearby, someone kneels before a fire, whispering a confession in broken Nahuatl. The priest presses a hand to their shoulder. No words, just smoke, and a small bowl of something hot and bitter waiting nearby. Justice here isn't about scaring people off. It's about realignment, cosmic maintenance. And yes, sometimes that requires cornmeal, crocodile dung, and chili pepper smoke blown directly into your face. The gods, it seems, have a taste for drama. You leave the temple with a strange sense of peace. Everything here has a rhythm. Guilt, confession, correction, return. Not every punishment was about pain. Sometimes it was about humility. Sometimes it was about chili. You descend a stone staircase carved into the hillside, following the low thrum of drums echoing in the air. The sound grows louder with each step until you reach a wide ceremonial platform lined with pillars. The scent of burning copal clings to your nose again, but this time, it's mingled with something metallic. You've entered the realm of elite punishment, the domain where failing the gods wasn't just inconvenient. It was cosmic treason. Among the Aztecs, the higher your status, the more spectacular your downfall. If you're a noble priest or military leader and you mess up, the gods don't just want you corrected, they want a show. You walk past a stone slab slick with age, where high-ranking wrongdoers once paid their dues. A noble caught embezzling temple offerings, for example, didn't just lose their job. They were stripped, literally, of their fine clothing, their jewelry, and their dignity. Then they were paraded through the streets in commoner rags, head bowed, hands bound in woven rope. This was the Aztec version of being unverified. A total social demotion. But this wasn't the end. After the parade, the offender would be brought before a council of elders. These weren't stern but understanding types. Think more divinely appointed life coaches with obsidian knives. Their verdict could include property seizure, ritual humiliation, or worse, being turned into a cautionary tale. In some elite cases, the punishment was symbolic execution. That means you weren't actually killed, but you were made to pretend you had been. They'd hold a mock funeral, dress a dummy in your finest clothes, and bury it with fake offerings. You'd be banished for a year, and during that time people would act like you were dead. Total social erasure. And let's be honest, for a noble obsessed with legacy and reputation, that might have been worse than death. Historians still argue whether these symbolic punishments were more common than actual executions among the elite. Some think they were used to spare noble blood. Others say it was a kind of mercy for those who still had political utility. Either way, the message was clear. Prestige isn't protection. If anything, it's a bigger target. You pass by a large obsidian mirror embedded in a wall. This was the sacred emblem of Tezcatlipoca, the god of fate, night, and punishment. He wasn't the gentle type. His name literally means smoking mirror. And if you were accused of pride, arrogance, or vanity, guess whose mirror you got to stare into for hours during your trial? The trial itself could be a ritual performance. The accused noble would be asked to recount their deeds. Not just the bad, but the good too. This wasn't flattery. This was for the gods to weigh your soul. You had to sit still, hands bound, while others described your missteps in precise detail. And sometimes, if Tezcatlipoca was feeling particularly dramatic, or the priests were, you'd be required to sing your confession aloud. Imagine doing a musical number about your tax fraud. Very Broadway meets divine judgment. But not every punishment was ceremonial. Some were brutally real. Military leaders who led failed campaigns without divine permission could be executed, especially if they disrespected war rituals or spilled sacred blood improperly. They weren't just killed. They were rejected by the gods. No burial, no offerings, just silence. You turn into a corridor etched with scenes of warriors standing before judges. One of them wears a jaguar pelt, stripped of its former glory. His punishment? He allowed his troops to loot a temple. An act considered not just theft, but cosmic imbalance. His sentence wasn't death, but exile. Stripped of his title, his home, and his role in the military, he became a wandering ghost in his own city. And here's a quirky detail. Elite offenders might also be required to serve in temples, not as priests but as servants. Imagine a former general sweeping temple floors while novices whisper behind their hands. Or a disgraced judge forced to maintain the public latrines. The goal? Humility. Public, prolonged, and slightly stinky humility. There's one particularly bizarre form of elite punishment that's almost too fringe to believe: the feather duty. In rare cases, an offending noble was required to spend an entire lunar cycle collecting sacred feathers from specific birds, by hand, without assistance. This wasn't just tedious, it was dangerous. Some of those birds nested in high-altitude canyons. Good luck explaining that injury at the next noble meeting. You pause by a small altar adorned with broken jade, a symbol of beauty tarnished. Here, nobles guilty of abusing power were made to give up one prized possession: an heirloom sword, a feathered cloak, even a child's naming stone. These items would be ritually destroyed or cast into sacred waters, symbolizing the cleansing of arrogance. Historians often wonder how these elite punishments affected social order. Did they deter corruption? Or were they theatrical performances to maintain public faith in justice? Some scholars lean toward the latter. After all, nothing reinforces your loyalty to the law like seeing a duke scrub temple tiles with a toothbrush-sized reed. And let's not forget the role of family. When a noble messed up, it wasn't just their reputation that crumbled. It was the whole lineage. Families would hold private rituals of mourning or penance, distancing themselves from the accused until they could be ritually reintegrated. That's right. Cosmic timeouts ran deep. As you step out onto the courtyard again, Moonlight glints off a ceremonial blade. You shudder. Not from fear but from understanding. The higher you climbed in Aztec society, the more elaborate, and sometimes ridiculous, your fall became. Justice wasn't blind here. It was watching, and it expected a performance. So as you walk past a row of faded murals depicting nobles crying into bowls of maize, you realize something. The Aztecs didn't just punish you. They wrote you into a story, a cautionary tale, a cosmic parable with feathers, chili, and public embarrassment. You meander through the outer edge of the ceremonial center now, where the stones grow colder and the air feels heavier, quieter. This is where punishments weren't symbolic, or spiritual, or performative. They were final. Tonight, you're crossing into the realm of capital punishment. Yes, the Aztecs had a flair for the dramatic in life, but they took their executions seriously. And sometimes, surprisingly, with more nuance than you'd expect from a culture often reduced to clichés of endless sacrifice. You step into a quiet plaza, the kind that looks deceptively serene until you realize its stones were once slick with ritual blood. But here's the twist. Not every execution was religious. Many were judicial, carried out not in temples, but in public markets or council courts. And despite the gore factor you're probably bracing for, Aztec capital punishment was actually kind of bureaucratic. Punishable offenses by death included treason, adultery, but only in certain cases, rape, sorcery used for harm, and some types of theft, especially if the thief was caught red-handed more than once. For nobles, mismanaging tribute or disrespecting the emperor could send you straight to the executioner. But here's something interesting. In many cases, death wasn't the first option. It was the last. The Aztecs believed in proportional justice. A first-time thief might get restitution and public shaming. A second offense? Public beating. A third? Well, that's when you'd get marched to the execution stone. Kind of like a cosmic three-strikes policy with obsidian. And even then, the method of execution varied. It wasn't all heart extraction and fire pits. Sometimes the condemned would be strangled, a quiet, almost clinical method. Other times they were clubbed to death, especially if they were considered dangerous to others. One of the most chilling, and yes, weirdly creative methods was being thrown off a cliff at Chapultepec. Gravity as divine enforcer. Historians still debate whether these capital punishments were as frequent as often portrayed. Some say they were ritualized events reserved for sacred festivals. Others argue that common courts issued death sentences regularly, especially in major cities like Tenochtitlan. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Public executions happened, but each one carried weight. They were civic events. Everyone watched. Everyone learned. And of course, there was Tlaquetzalli, the punishment of the people. A kind of community-sanctioned execution for the worst of crimes. In these rare cases, the condemned would be brought to the marketplace, their crimes announced by a herald, and the community itself would carry out the sentence. Think of it as civic participation at its most brutal. But hey, at least no one could claim the system wasn't transparent. One mainstream fact that might surprise you. Even children could face capital punishment. But, and this is important, it was extraordinarily rare. The Aztecs valued children as future contributors to the empire. A young offender would be corrected, recorrected, and publicly recorrected before anyone even thought about harsher penalties. But in extreme cases like plotting rebellion or poisoning a priest, both actual documented accusations, children could be executed. Gently. Allegedly. Some sources claim the methods used were designed to be painless. Others not so much. You stop by a carved stone ring embedded in the courtyard floor. It's part of an old ball court. And yes, sometimes the losing team in sacred games was executed. But not always. That part's a bit of historical telephone. In most cases, the losers die version was reserved for special games dedicated to gods of death or war. And even then, the ones executed were usually volunteers, prisoners of war chosen for their strength and honor. It was a bizarre privilege. A kind of lethal MVP award. And it gets stranger. There's a record of one particular ceremony in which the condemned man was dressed as a god for a full year before his execution. He was fed, pampered, taught to play instruments, and given women for company. Then on a set day, he walked up the temple steps and was sacrificed. This wasn't punishment, it was theatrical deification. The man's death wasn't justice. It was theology. But not every execution was so poetic. Some punishments were just darkly practical. Take adulterers, for example. A married woman caught cheating could be stoned to death, but only if she was a repeat offender or if her husband pressed the case. In other instances, she might have her hair cut short and be paraded through the streets. Shame before the blade. Men caught in adultery could face strangulation or, in some fringe cases, being bound and left exposed to the elements. One account describes a noble who had to sleep on a roof during the rainy season for 40 nights as punishment. Not execution per se, but the pneumonia probably did the job. Historians still argue whether this was a real sentence, or just a morality tale used to scare young lovers straight. You sit for a moment on a weather-worn bench beside a stone effigy of Mictlantecuhtli, the skeletal god of death. His jaw is open in a perpetual grin. Mocking, welcoming, hard to say. This was the ultimate judge, and if you landed in Mictlan, the underworld, it meant your death was natural. But if your crime was great enough, the gods might refuse your soul entry altogether. Eternal wandering. No afterlife. Cosmic cancellation. Yet, even in this grim landscape, there's something eerily balanced about it all. Aztec justice wasn't random cruelty. It was rule-bound, scaled, predictable in its own terrifying way. And often the condemned walked willingly to their deaths, believing that in sacrifice, even judicial, there was redemption. You get up and continue walking, past the ghostly edges of a plaza where the final words of hundreds must have echoed. It's quieter now. No drums, no chanting, just stone and sky. The Aztecs understood something we often forget. Punishment wasn't just about retribution. It was about cosmic order, keeping the world spinning one verdict at a time. And if that meant tossing someone off a cliff once in a while, well, gravity never lies. You walk now along a raised aqueduct, where the hum of water moving beneath the stone sounds oddly calming. But don't get too relaxed. This tranquil structure leads to one of the most peculiar corners of Aztec law: punishments for everyday folks. Not priests or nobles or war captives, but regular citizens, merchants, farmers, artisans, even gossiping neighbors. And here's the kicker. The more normal your life, the more bizarre your punishment could be. That's because Aztec law didn't just exist to keep you in line. It aimed to align you with the cosmic rhythm. So if you, a humble tortilla vendor, accidentally overcharged your neighbor, you weren't just committing fraud, you were nudging the sun off course. Again, so no pressure. You pass into the market district now, where trade once buzzed through every corner of Tenochtitlan. Picture it. Colorful stalls, the scent of chili and cacao, and a lot of very watchful judges stationed right in the square. That's right, every major market had an on-site tribunal. So if you tried to pass off stale tamales as fresh, you could be reported, judged, and punished on the spot. Swift Justice, Market Edition. First-time offenders often received what we'd call creative correction. If a seller used rigged weights, for example, they might be forced to wear those same weights as jewelry, publicly, while customers shouted prices at them all day. Is it humiliating? Yes. Is it petty genius? Also yes. Quirky punishments abounded for minor infractions. You might be forced to sweep the streets with a feather duster for a week, or carry a clay pot on your head without breaking it, symbolizing the fragile trust between neighbors. One popular sentence for public drunkenness involved being tied to a post with pulque, the fermented drink you probably had too much of, poured over your head. That's what we'd call a very sticky intervention. Historians still argue whether these punishments were codified or largely up to the judge's creativity. Some sources suggest a strict legal system. Others hint that flexibility and spectacle mattered more. Either way, they were rarely about pain. They were about learning. Or at least learning not to get caught in the middle of the plaza with a goose under your cloak and a very guilty look on your face. Oh, and speaking of animals, there's a recorded punishment involving a man who stole a prize turkey from a neighbor's pen. His sentence: for 10 days he had to act like a turkey, complete with feathers and awkward gobbling. He couldn't speak unless spoken to, and even then, he had to reply in bird noises. No, this wasn't a fraternity prank. It was Aztec justice. And you better believe everyone in that neighborhood remembered it. One mainstream historical fact that pops up in many codices: domestic disputes were often settled by elders, not officials. If a husband was too controlling or a wife was suspected of sabotage, and yes, we're talking chili in the underwear kind of sabotage, the couple might be sentenced to public reconciliation rituals. These involved sharing a meal together in silence while seated on cold stone. If that sounds like the ancient version of awkward couples therapy, you're exactly right. And of course, there was the Kalmakak, the school for elite children, where bad behavior was corrected through a mix of discipline and low-key terror. Late to class? That's a beating. Spoke out of turn? More beatings. Refused to sweep the temple steps correctly? You were forced to inhale chili smoke in a confined space. That's right, Aztec timeout involved hot pepper vapors and a strong gag reflex. It wasn't just school kids who got the chili treatment. Repeat adult offenders could be sentenced to the temazcal, a kind of sweat lodge. But this wasn't spa day. The steam was infused with burning chilies, and the offender would sit in that stinging, eye-watering fog until they were sufficiently cleansed. If you've ever cut jalapenos and rubbed your eye, you know the kind of lesson that sticks. Interestingly, while the Aztecs had harsh penalties, they also believed in reform. For example, an artisan who committed theft might be ordered to produce a series of intricate works for the community as atonement. Beauty as penance. And there's something kind of poetic about that. But even for commoners, some crimes were considered unforgivable. Abandoning your family, conspiring with enemy states, or showing public disrespect to the gods could bring harsh punishment, sometimes even death. One curious law states that a man who struck his mother could be executed, unless she forgave him on the spot. That's one intense forgiveness window. You better hope she's in a good mood that day. As you turn into a quieter alley of the reconstructed cityscape, you notice something carved into the walls. Rows of stick figure images showing people in odd poses. This is a visual law code, a way to teach punishment through pictographs. There's the man being flogged for false accusations. There's another doing some kind of chicken dance, possibly turkey impersonation again. The takeaway? Aztec justice was public, visual, and highly memorable. One odd, fringe case often debated among scholars involves a farmer who sold rainwater to travelers during the dry season. His sentence? To sit beneath a leaking thatched roof for an entire rainy season, barefoot and exposed. He was required to absorb the blessings of Tlaloc directly. It's unclear if this was real or just a parable to discourage price gouging, but still, a damp form of enlightenment. You walk past an empty bench in the shade. It looks simple, but it's built over a space where petty criminals once sat during public announcements, naked except for painted symbols of their crimes on their backs. A warning to all who passed, and possibly a great motivator to behave next time you forgot to pay tribute on time. Through all this, you sense the guiding principle of Aztec justice wasn't cruelty, it was order. Everyone, from merchants to priests, had a role, and the punishments weren't just deterrents. They were stories wrapped in feathers, chilies, and social theater. You didn't just pay for your mistake, you became a living billboard for cosmic morality. You walk now beneath the long shadows cast by tall wooden poles. They stand like totems of forgotten warnings, and you quickly realize, these aren't just ceremonial markers. These were once part of the Tzompantli, the infamous skull racks of the Aztec world. Now, before your imagination runs wild with horror movie visuals, take a breath. Yes, there were skulls. And yes, they were displayed. But no, it wasn't a free-for-all of carnage. There was method to the madness, cosmic, symbolic, and strangely bureaucratic. The Tzompantli wasn't primarily for criminals or petty offenders. It was reserved for ritual sacrifices, captured warriors mostly, whose skulls served as offerings to the gods. Each one, mounted in precise rows, was a visual hymn to Huitzilopochtli, god of war and sun. And while these displays seem gruesome to us, they weren't about instilling fear in the general population. They were about maintaining cosmic order. Think of them as divine spreadsheets, columns and rows of skulls, recording a balance sheet of blood. But not all skulls on display belonged to enemy warriors. Some belonged to Aztecs, those who broke taboos so sacred that only a public, eternal reminder would suffice. Imagine being the one person in your community whose skull ended up next to the honored war dead, but for reasons decidedly less noble. Embarrassing doesn't quite cover it. You trace a path now through the area known as the Tzompantli, the Great Skull Rack of Tenochtitlan. It was no urban legend. Archaeologists have uncovered remains of over 600 skulls arranged in what was once a circular tower, its base formed entirely of mortared bone. Scholars still argue whether these towers were ceremonial platforms or literal walls. Either way, they were architectural statements, equal parts temples, scoreboard, and warning sign. What kind of crime could land you on the Tsimpanli if you were a local? Blasphemy against the gods, for one. Sacrilegious acts, like urinating in a temple or defacing a statue, weren't just disrespectful. They were cosmic sabotage, and sabotage had consequences. One fringe case speaks of a man who spat on a statue of Tezcatlipoca during a drunken rant. He was executed, and his skull, legend claims, was painted obsidian black and placed on a corner post as a lesson in both reverence and breath control. But sometimes the path to the skull rack was less scandalous and more political. Take the story of a rebellious noble who opposed increased tribute payments. Though he didn't incite violence, his vocal defiance was enough to earn him a quick trial and a permanent spot on the rack. His skull placed higher than the rest, ironically granting him visibility he'd never achieved in life. Historians still debate whether this was justice or spectacle, or some strategic blend of both. One mainstream historical truth: the Aztecs considered the skull to be a symbol of life, not just death. In the ritual calendar, skulls appeared on feast days related to agriculture and rebirth. Some were decorated with precious stones, others with carved messages or glyphs. A decapitated head wasn't just evidence of punishment, it was a message. And messages need an audience. Curiously, the skull racks weren't necessarily intended to frighten the population. Many Aztec citizens likely viewed them with awe or even pride, especially when the skulls belonged to enemies vanquished in ritual war. Children passed by the Tsimpanli every day on their way to school. Imagine that as your morning commute backdrop. Birdsong, street vendors, and a gentle reminder of divine justice via bone display. But here's where things get weird. Some skulls weren't real. Archaeologists have found decorative replicas mixed into the racks, carved from wood or stone, or shaped from hardened clay. Were these used to fill out the display during years of peace, when enemy captives were scarce? Or were they symbolic placeholders, used to represent cosmic debts not yet paid? Scholars remain divided. It's like the ancient version of inflating your numbers. And the skulls weren't just decorations. They were sometimes used in ritual theater. Dancers would wear them as masks or adorn their costumes with jawbones that rattled as they moved. There's a fringe tale about a festival where performers played instruments made from enemy skulls, flutes and drums that produced the voice of the gods. If true, it paints an eerie but fascinating picture of how music, punishment, and belief intersected. You duck through a reconstructed doorway now and find yourself in a darker room, what might have been a court official's chamber. It's dim and still. This is where decisions were made. Sometimes it wasn't about what law was broken but who broke it. Aztec justice was hierarchical. Commoners could be executed for offenses that nobles might talk their way out of. But here's a fun twist. Nobles could receive harsher penalties for the same crime. That's right, if you were rich, the gods expected more from you. A noble thief might be publicly humiliated and executed, where a common thief might just lose a hand or serve community labor. It was divine accountability. And if you think modern society lacks that kind of moral symmetry, well, you're not alone. Back out in the plaza, you see the base of what used to be a large platform. This was a speaking stage, where judges sometimes explained why a particular punishment was handed down. Not to the condemned, but to the crowd. The people had to understand the reasoning. Punishment wasn't private, it was pedagogical. No court secrecy. No sealed files. Just open-air judgment and a rotating cast of very unlucky examples. And that's what made it stick. You weren't just watching punishment. You were learning from it. Every skull on that rack, every symbol painted on a prisoner's back, was a page in the great book of communal memory. The Aztecs understood that justice wasn't just about pain, it was about permanence. You take one last look at the faint shadows stretching across the old rack site. They're not scary now, just quiet. The bone tower is gone, the skulls return to dust or museum displays. But the message remains. Keep the balance. Follow the code. Respect the sun and the soil. Or you might just end up as a permanent part of someone else's bedtime history lesson. You now pass into one of the more obscure and unsettling corners of the empire, where the laws weren't just enforced by people, but believed to be backed by divine creatures. No, really. This is the realm where criminal behavior could offend not only your neighbors or the emperor, but the unseen spirits and gods who lived just a few layers beneath the world you walked. So if you committed a crime, there was a decent chance you'd be punished twice, once by human law, and again cosmically by the metaphysical enforcers. The Aztecs had a word for this spiritual imbalance. Teotl. Break the harmony, and it wasn't just your body at risk. Your soul, your family, and sometimes your corn crop might get dragged into the cosmic mess. You cross the threshold into a temple courtyard, a quiet place but not peaceful. Here, the punishments weren't so much about spectacle as they were about purification. Some acts, especially ritual violations or supernatural crimes like witchcraft or false prophecy, had no earthly remedy. Instead, they required what you might call a spiritual reset button. Enter the world of metaphysical punishment. Now, don't let the fancy title fool you. Sometimes these spiritual resets involved actual physical suffering. You might be buried up to your neck and forced to chant hymns for days while people threw petals, or more often pebbles, at your face. Or you'd be marched blindfolded to a sacred cave, left there to commune with the gods, and not retrieved until you admitted what you'd done wrong, which you always did eventually. Dark caves have that effect. A mainstream historical fact here. The Aztecs believed in tonality, a sort of spiritual heat or soul energy stored in the head. Crimes, especially those that dishonored the gods, could disrupt this force. So certain punishments weren't about death, but about cooling the offender down. Literally. Some criminals were submerged in cold spring water, sometimes for hours, while priests chanted and rubbed herbs over their heads. One scholar dubbed this spiritual hydrotherapy, which honestly sounds like something Gwyneth Paltrow would sell today. Fringe case time. One ancient text describes a woman accused of slandering a high priest, an act thought to disturb the divine balance. Instead of public execution, she was sentenced to wear a mask of obsidian shards glued to her face for 30 days. Each day, a shard was removed during a sunrise ritual, symbolizing the slow return of truth. Whether this really happened or was just moral theater. Historians still argue whether the obsidian mask was literal or metaphorical. But either way, it's a haunting image. Another peculiar ritual punishment involved being forced to eat only uncooked maize for weeks, stripped of salt and spice. No chili, no pulque, no fun. This was not dietary advice. It was a symbolic form of soul austerity. If your actions had offended the sacred order, you had to live without pleasure until your tonality settled back into harmony. Kind of like spiritual grounding with a side of bland corn. But it wasn't all about suffering. Some metaphysical punishments were elaborate performances. Picture this. A criminal dressed as a specific god, say Zyptotec, the flayed deity of renewal, and forced to dance through the temple grounds for an entire moon cycle. His movements were meant to tell a story of transgression and redemption. And the twist? The better the performance, the more likely he was to be forgiven and spared harsher penalties. A high-stakes interpretive dance-off with your life on the line. Of course, some punishments crossed the line into pure symbolic horror. One deeply debated account involves a man who tried to impersonate a priest to gain access to temple offerings. His sentence? He was shaved bald and painted white, then made to serve actual priests for a full year, never speaking, never eating at the same time as them, and never sleeping indoors. He became a living ghost, and by the end, many claimed he barely remembered his own name. You pass now by the ruins of a ritual chamber, open to the sky, where punishment wasn't meted out by guards or warriors, but by priests. And these weren't your gentle-robed philosophers. Aztec priests could be terrifying. They were trained in chants that made your hair stand up, and they knew herbs that made you confess things your own mother never suspected. Some rituals involved lying on an obsidian slab while priests swept your aura with branches dipped in sacred ink. This wasn't spa day, it was metaphysical mop-up. But perhaps the strangest punishment of all was one you carried with you. The ritual tattoo. Not decorative, not braggy, these tattoos were marks of transgression. One common version depicted a skull surrounded by crooked lines, symbolizing imbalance. Once inked, you were known by that mark. No hiding. No pretending. Your skin told your story. And depending on the crime, you might be denied access to temples, or even barred from public festivals until your behavior rebalanced. Historians still debate whether these tattoos were permanent or faded over time. Some argue they were made with a mix of ink and chalk, meant to wear off with redemption. Others think they were lifelong reminders. Either way, it's not your average "I was young and needed the ink" situation. This was courtroom sentencing via skin art. Then there were the spiritual oaths. These were terrifyingly binding. In certain cases, like accusing a noble of sorcery or invoking a god without permission, you might be forced to stand before a sacred idol and recite an oath that, if false, would curse your entire lineage. You'd have to name your ancestors and swear that they too would suffer if you lied. No one took that lightly. The fear wasn't prison. It was multi-generational divine retribution. That's some next-level accountability. And while all of this sounds heavy, you notice something oddly gentle in this section of the ruins. There's a garden nearby, lush and carefully tended. It was once a space for spiritual rehabilitation. People who completed their punishments here weren't just thrown back into society, they were slowly reintegrated. Fed warm food, given clean clothing, taught sacred songs again. Because the Aztecs didn't want permanent outcasts, they wanted rebalanced citizens. So as you move onward, the feeling is less grim and more reflective. Punishment in the spiritual realm wasn't about destroying someone. It was about clearing away the fog, realigning their soul with the stars, reminding them that the gods didn't just punish, they watched, waited, and sometimes forgave. You step now into a marketplace, alive with phantom footsteps and the ghosts of bargains past. Stalls once crammed with maize cakes, painted masks, woven cloaks, and obsidian blades stretch out before you, quiet now but dense with memory. It's in this bustling space, of all places, that one of the strangest kinds of Aztec punishment occurred. One where the law didn't just punish wrongdoers but occasionally turned the criminal into the product. Yes, really. You're about to learn what happened when justice decided you were worth more sold than scolded. The Aztecs were not shy about addressing debt. And when you couldn't pay, your options weren't limited to jail time or stern letters. Sometimes the sentence was enslavement. But here's the twist. Aztec slavery wasn't exactly the brutal generational institution you might associate with other empires. It was more of a legal and economic reset button. Temporary, reversible, sometimes even voluntary, but still unsettling. Let's say you borrowed a bunch of cacao beans to start your dream tortilla stand. The gods weren't on your side, business tanked, and now you're broke. If your creditor took you to court and won, the judge might rule that you had to work off your debt, not by community service or jail time, but by becoming their property. You'd be taken to the market and sold, complete with a price tag and a ceremonial handshake. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Aztec legal codes permitted debt slavery as both punishment and civil contract. A person who defaulted on loans or committed a property-related crime could be sold, sometimes multiple times, but the enslavement wasn't for life. Once the debt was paid, either in labor or replacement, you could buy your freedom back. In some cases, relatives pooled resources to free you early, kind of like ancient GoFundMe, but with more feathers and fewer status updates. But oh, the process. If you were sentenced to slavery, the trip to the market wasn't just a handoff. You were painted with specific colors, yellow and white were common, and you wore a wooden collar around your neck to signal your status. You stood on display, sometimes for hours, while potential buyers examined you like livestock. Your dignity wasn't just dented, it was openly tagged. A quirky little detail? You could escape slavery just by reaching the royal palace or a temple and declaring your case. If you made it, you were granted asylum and given the chance to explain or appeal. And people tried. Every few weeks, a desperate debtor would break away from the market, sprinting through the crowded causeways in a full-on paint-smeared panic. Some made it. Others, well, running with a neck yoke isn't exactly aerodynamic. But you didn't even need to commit a crime to end up here. Some people sold themselves into slavery to escape punishment for other offenses. You might approach a market official and offer yourself to a wealthy noble in exchange for protection or food. It was seen as honorable in some circles, better to serve humbly than be publicly humiliated. Historians still argue whether this practice leaned more toward desperation or social strategy. Now here's a fringe tale. One document from colonial accounts tells of a man who, after getting caught stealing from the temple kitchens, offered himself as a cook slave for the very priests he robbed. They accepted, on the condition that he prepare all meals blindfolded, so as not to covet again. He worked there for 6 years and later became a respected chef. Real story? Urban legend? The jury's out, but it makes for a spicy bedtime fable. Punishment by slavery wasn't always individual either. Entire families could be affected. If a father was sentenced, his children might be taken into bonded labor as well, though not indefinitely. The Aztecs were strict about ending generational servitude. A child born to a slave was not automatically a slave. And if you think that sounds surprisingly progressive, it kind of is. But let's not romanticize it. Being sold in a marketplace with bells tied to your ankles so no one lost track of you? Still humiliating. Oh, and speaking of bells, that was one of the classic tools used to mark court-ordered slaves. Tiny copper bells braided into your hair or attached to your waistband. They jingled when you walked, announcing your shame to anyone listening. It wasn't enough to suffer, you had to sound like it too. Imagine being the human version of a warning ringtone. One particularly bizarre market punishment involved public auctioning of stolen items by the criminal themselves. If you stole something, you might be ordered to return it and sell it back in the same market you took it from, narrating your crime to every buyer who stopped by. Talk about product placement. One old tale describes a young man forced to spend 4 market days explaining how he'd stolen a rare turquoise pendant. By day 2, people started throwing tortilla bits at him. By day 4, he had a full-blown sunburn and a new respect for not touching shiny things. Another wrinkle. Some criminals tried to fake enslavement to avoid harsher punishments. They'd arrange with a friend to buy them at market and hide them away until things cooled down. But judges caught on. New laws were written to make sure that punishment sales were witnessed by temple scribes, complete with glyph-stamped contracts and, if needed, priestly supervision. You couldn't just vanish into a noble's garden and call that justice. The Aztecs even developed legal distinctions between voluntary, debt, and punishment slavery. It wasn't a one-size-fits-all shame scarf. Each type came with different rights and durations. Some slaves could own property. Others could marry freely. If your crime was minor and this was your first offense, your servitude might last only a season. Still, punishment by market had a profound psychological edge. Unlike physical penalties that faded with time, this one lived in your memory. The looks, the whispers, the sting of being assigned a price tag lower than your neighbor's dog. One fringe record describes a man whose assigned price was so low that he burst into tears on the spot. The judge raised it out of pity, which somehow made it worse. And yet, through all of this, you get the sense that the system wasn't purely about vengeance. It was about correction, containment, and sometimes even compassion. People made mistakes. The market gave them a way back, bruised maybe but not broken. As you walk away from the ghostly bustle, you hear the echo of clinking bells, fading down a corridor of time. The stalls are gone. The judgment's rendered. But the idea lingers. Sometimes, to fix what's broken, society had to place a value on the person and the crime, even if that meant turning punishment into public commerce. And so you find yourself wandering slowly now, as if the weight of 15,000 years of blood and bureaucracy has finally caught up with you. You step softly through the ruins, stone corridors under moonlight, soft moss reclaiming what punishment once owned. There's no one left to scream here. Only silence, and perhaps the whisper of bones that once cracked under the weight of empires. You peer down into what was once a holding pit, an Aztec prison if the term even fits. It's not a cage, not the barred boxes of modern imagination. No, this was more like a public waiting room for fate. Offenders stood shackled in public view, shamed, spat upon, and sometimes serenaded by passing street musicians with a particularly vengeful sense of humor. Historians still argue whether these public humiliation sites were primarily punitive, or if they doubled as moral theaters for the masses. Either way, the echoes linger. The skeletons unearthed here are telling. Some are contorted in unnatural postures, suggesting restraint over long periods. Others show evidence of healed fractures, meaning someone survived their punishment at least for a while. And then there are the teeth, worn down, filed, or purposefully pulled as part of judicial ritual. One skull, delicately preserved, bears a tiny turquoise inlay in a front incisor. A badge of dishonor? A cursed cosmetic? Scholars can't quite agree. But it glints at you now from under a layer of soil. like a misplaced gemstone in a graveyard of forgotten decisions. As you shuffle past these ghostly relics, it becomes clear. The Aztecs didn't just punish the body, they punished the narrative of a person. To be flayed was not just to die, but to be rebranded, rewritten, erased, and repurposed. Your skin might end up as the cloak of a priest or the grim decor for a festival. Your name might disappear entirely. Or worse, be remembered only as a cautionary tale told in hushed tones over smoky fires. You duck into a side chamber low-ceilinged and cold. It's here that archaeologists found dozens of shackles made from obsidian, sharp, glass-like volcanic rock. Imagine being bound by something that cuts as it holds. The symbolism is poetic if you squint a little. Pain is the chain that keeps you still. Very on brand for the Aztecs. But now your mind begins to drift. And not just because of the fading torchlight. The punishments we've explored, as brutal as they are, form a tapestry. A strange, sharp-edged culture that stitched together justice, religion, and theater into one long blood-soaked performance. And it didn't end with the Aztecs. When the Spanish arrived with their armor, their horses, and their holy ambition, they gasped at the sight of human sacrifice, and then quietly borrowed bits of the playbook. Auto da fe, anyone? Public burnings, symbolic humiliation, show trials. The flavors changed. The core ingredients? Not so much. Centuries later, you start to see similar echoes in modern justice systems. Less flaying, thankfully, but public shame, exile, and reputation erasure? Still thriving. A failed tweet may not be a ceremonial whipping, but it sure gets the crowd riled up. You feel the floor slope downward now, spiraling into what might be a ritual shaft or a drainage tunnel, or, because this is Aztec architecture, both. The smell is loamy and ancient, and your footsteps echo longer than they should. In this closing quiet, you begin to wonder not just about the people who received these punishments, but those who handed them out. Did they sleep soundly at night? Were they feared, admired, or quietly resented? One unearthed codex speaks of a priest judge who wept openly after sentencing a teenage boy to death for stealing ceremonial maize. The community insisted. The law demanded it. But still he cried. Maybe not everyone was immune to the burden of justice. Maybe the human cost left a residue on the soul. Even in an empire so rehearsed in cruelty, there's a final alcove ahead, lit only by imagination. You pause. Inside lies the last unearthed figure, a woman buried upright, hands bound in front, head tilted as if still listening. No name, no record. Perhaps she was a criminal. Perhaps she was framed. Perhaps she simply knew too much. You'll never know. She's yours now in this moment. A silent reminder that history's cruelties don't always leave clear reasons, only residues. And with that, we slow the pace. Your breath softens now, slower, in rhythm with the way dust settles undisturbed across centuries. The sharp edges of ancient law blur like sandstone in wind, smoothed by time, by forgetting, by sleep. You're no longer walking the stone corridors of Tenochtitlan or tracing obsidian scars on buried bones. You're drifting now, light as smoke rising from a long cold brazier. The noise of the world, the drums, the cries, the footsteps of empire, all fall away. Whatever weight you brought into this night, it can rest here. The empires rose. They punished. They fell. And still, the world turns softly beneath you. Let it. The past doesn't need you to solve it tonight. The air around you is quiet now. Not silent, there's always a soft hum. Maybe from that fan in the corner, maybe from history itself. Let it lull you. Let your limbs grow heavy. There's nothing left to flay, nothing left to fear. Just the slow hush of ancient soil and the comfort of knowing. It's over. The stories have been told. Tomorrow maybe you'll remember a strange punishment or a jeweled tooth. Or maybe you won't. That's okay too. The point was never the details. The point was the journey down into something forgotten. Something dust-covered. Something slow enough to help you sleep. So now if your eyes are still open, let them fall closed. You've earned this quiet. This stillness. This rest. Good night.